All right, hello and welcome back. So in this video, we are going to go over the Eightfold Path that is prescribed in the fourth noble truth, as we have already kind of looked at it. Now, the Eightfold Path is essentially the guide to living. We could maybe compare this from a Christian worldview as like the Ten Commandments, something like that. But again, this is not given by God, right? Does Siddhartha Gautama or the Buddha, does he prescribe this? Yes, it seems so. But he does not claim to be God. He just says, I'm a guy. This seems like the right way to go. Okay, so we have eight sort of, I guess, an eightfold path. So the first one is to have a right understanding. And this is to understand the nature of existence in the way that the Four Noble Truths says. You know, we've got suffering and basically how we understand the world. And the nature of and how unsatisfactory this is. Okay, so understanding the Four Noble Truths. The second is right thought. And this is basically having good internal intentions. You don't have evil intentions, whatever that means, but we have goodwill. We're harmless. We are moving our mind away from harmful desires. So this is the idea of right thought, right speech. We can pretty much just infer what that means. That is just speaking in a way that is truthful and positive and all of these things. Right action is to act in a morally upright way. Right livelihood is to have some kind of a profession that is honorable. You're not a thief. You're not, something like that. So our livelihood is done in a morally acceptable way. Right effort is to essentially work diligently. Don't abandon, people who depend on you. So that's essentially right effort. Right mindfulness is to maintain awareness of your body and your emotions and, where your experience is, and to continue having that in the present and to have that in a positive way. And then right concentration is to, I'm just going to read this one because this one I'm not familiar with, developing deep states of mental focus and meditation, culminating in the achievement of basically pure full mindfulness, I think is maybe the best way to say that. That's a little bit of jargon there, but okay. So this is the Eightfold Path. Now, again, I want to stress that this is a works-based religion. So in order to reach nirvana or even to be reincarnated as something that is a human or better, a god, you have to do good enough. And so there is obviously a judgment process that comes into play here somehow. But there is a couple things that I want to point out before we continue with the Eightfold Path. And that is, we have to have all of these right things. We have to have a right understanding. And who is it, or how is right understanding determined? And this is, so there's a grounding issue. When you went through the relativism course, you will very quickly see we can begin to discuss relativism and relativistic issues with pantheists, because right understanding, well, who determines right understanding or right thought? Well, who determines what these good intentions are? Or right speech, truthful, positive? Who determines truth? Where does that come from? So, well, you should speak truthfully. Well, who determines that? And they cannot say God, because on their view, there is no personhood that is God that exists perfectly in the theistic sense. Their God is a non-conscious, it is just the material in the universe. And so they will say, the universe has blessed me. But these things don't make logical sense because the universe isn't conscious. The universe cannot do blessing because the universe cannot do anything. It just exists. And so how do we define right speech? How do we define right action and conducting yourself in a moral manner? So a lot of these eightfold paths are going to begin to be logically and philosophically unfounded and ungrounded when we start to dig into them, because there is no grounding source on their religion. They don't have a God to say everything is right. And if they try to ground it in a specific Buddhist God that is just itself reincarnated human, well, which one of those? Do they all have the same moral structure? Because if they do, why do they all have the same moral structure? Does that come? That's got to be grounded somewhere. What God does that come from? And they don't have somewhere to bring this down to. So this is the Eightfold Path, and some ways we can actually pull these back into arguments for relativism and approach this conversation in this way. Zach, do you want to add anything there?
I don't really have a whole lot to add on to it, other than one of the things that you might touch on that you told me a long time ago is that when you're having conversations with these people who uh, typically adhere to these types of belief systems, using logic can prove to be less effective. It's
Yes.
it's the tool that we have, but what would you say the a good angle to come from is then if you're having a hard time getting them to understand why the logical fallacy has any weight or bearing?
Yes. Great question. So, um, yeah. So when talking to people of Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, one of the things you're right, we have to recognize is the reason we use logic in the West is because we have Western philosophy. Well, Eastern philosophy is different than Western philosophy. We say logic. That is where science came from. That is why science developed in the West, because Judeo-Christian morality says there is an orderly world, and we can understand that order because God put the order there, and God's a person, and we can understand God by understanding the order, and then we can make predictions about that order. And this is where the scientific method arises from, is this philosophy. Well, they don't have the necessity for logic in their worldview like we do in Western philosophy, because they don't have Western philosophy in many cases. And so if you're running up against the, well, I don't really care about logic, it's not really registering because they don't think that way, what you're going to want to try to do, and I have not personally had to do this in the past. I've talked with a limited number of Buddhists I have, but more of it's more new age in the US. And that's more of you take relativism, and that's pretty effective. But if you're going to go after the individual who's not committed to logic, what you're probably going to want to do is to see if they believe that Jesus is one of the reincarnated gods who rejected nirvana and has stayed to point us on the right path. And if you can say, if they will agree to that, then you can say, well, look, the Bible is an excellent historically verifiable account of Jesus and his life and what he said. And we can show them evidence that the Bible's and the words of Jesus are historically accurate. And then we can begin saying, okay, so if Jesus is a God, what is he saying? And then we can approach in an authoritative manner the words of Christ there. So that might be one way to do that. And we can even reference Christ when he says, he is the only way. So now, okay, he is a God in Buddhism, but he's the only way. So actually what he's saying, and that may be one way to go about it. That is the only way I have heard to address that. And there may be more, but, admittedly, I wouldn't say I'm like the world's expert in talking to Buddhists. We're kind of breaking this down as a base model. So do you have any thoughts beyond that?
I don't have any thoughts on specific angles to take. I did just do a quick Google on how to share the gospel with a Buddhist.
Right.
And there's some good questions that look like they could be asked that appeal more to the emotional side, right? So one of
Yes.
them being, um, why do you think there's evil and suffering in the world?
Which is a grounding
Who
issue. So I want to point that out. When we ask, why do you think there is evil and suffering? Where does evil come from? Where does suffering come from? Where do you philosophically ground that? They have no place to ground it. It is an unexplainable phenomenon because there is no God. There is no spiritual entities.
Another one this does the same thing, right? Is who or what set the law of karma in place?
And yep,
Same thing.
that's a lesson. You're coming up on a lesson.
Yep. Oh
Excellent.
yeah.
Yes.
Have you ever felt the need to be forgiven? How would you feel if you discovered that someone suffered in your place so that you wouldn't have to? I think that's actually really,
That's actually really
um,
good. That's beautiful because that ties into their own worldview on suffering. That's great.
exactly.
Wow.
Yep, precisely. That's really good.
Love
And
that.
then, have you ever heard of okay, this one's really cool too. Have you ever heard of the path to inner peace that is apart from ridding yourself of all your desires and attachments? So you're actually
Yes.
playing into it again, saying that there is another path to peace. and it
Excellent.
doesn't necessitate that you
All this work.
empty yourself. Yep.
Excellent. Well, maybe we can get into more of those in a future video too, because some of those are really good. And I love how they're tying it into the biblical worldview. So it's more of a coming alongside and communicating as opposed to a direct. And a lot of times we talk about apologetics as a direct sort of like idea v idea. Now, of course, if you take the evangelism course, when you actually implement this, you should not be having a debate with someone. So the implementation is much more friendly than our training here because we're just directly saying what the contradictions are, but the communication's different. So I really like those. Okay, well, in the next video, we're going to keep going and we're going to get a little bit further into Buddhism. We'll see you there. God bless.